We're talking about your wallet, your job, your future. And that's why we're here, to unpack the policy platforms of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump for the 2024 U.S. presidential election. All right, buckle up, folks, because we're diving into a real showdown this time. Imagine a world where taxes on your tips disappear, or you get like a $25,000 boost for your first home. Sounds pretty wild, right?
Yeah, those are some eye-catching promises for sure. But as with anything in politics, the devil's in the details.
Exactly. And that's why we're here, to unpack the policy platforms of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump for the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Think of this as your no BS guide to what they're actually proposing.
We'll be looking at everything from the economy and immigration to healthcare and education, really dissecting those key issues that hit closest to home.
We're talking about your wallet, your job, your future. So let's kick things off with the economy and manufacturing, where things are already heating up. Harris is making a big play for the middle class with tax cuts, bringing back those child tax credits and earned income tax credits.
Meanwhile, Trump is going for that classic business boost with a proposed 15% corporate tax rate. But will that really trickle down to the average worker? That's the big question.
Right, because everyone's heard that trickle-down promise before. Now, both candidates are talking about bringing jobs back to America, but they're going about it in different ways. Harris is taking a hard line against what she sees as unfair trade practices, especially when it comes to China.
And Trump. Well, he's doubling down on that Buy American, Hire American slogan, focusing on revitalizing U.S. manufacturing. It's interesting to see how both are eyeing those future industries like clean energy and AI, but their strategies are miles apart.
Okay, let's switch gears to immigration, always a hot-button topic. Harris is pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, including a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants.
Trump, on the other hand, is sticking to that border security focus we've come to expect, promising more deportations and even talking about ending birthright citizenship.
But here's where it gets interesting. Trump has also floated this idea of automatically granting green cards to foreign graduates of U.S. universities.
Yeah, that's a curveball for sure. It seems like he's acknowledging the need for skilled workers even if they weren't born here. Could be a strategic move to attract some specific voters.
Speaking of attracting voters, let's talk about housing. Harris has laid out a plan to build 3 million affordable homes, and she wants to penalize companies that are hoarding homes and driving up those prices.
Trump's taking a different approach, blaming immigration for those rising housing costs and believing that reducing immigration is the answer. Two very different diagnoses for the same problem, right?
Totally. And then there's the issue of workers' rights. Harris is all about strengthening unions, pushing for the PRO Act, which would give them more leverage.
But Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, are firmly against the PRO Act. And you won't believe this, Trump has even considered the idea of firing striking workers.
Whoa, that's a bold move. Okay, let's zoom out to the world stage and talk foreign policy. We've got some serious showdowns brewing over Iran, Israel, China, Ukraine, you name it. It's clear these two have very different ideas about America's role in the world.
Their stances on China are especially interesting. Harris wants to hold them accountable for human rights violations while keeping those economic ties strong.
Trump's all about what he calls strategic independence from China, and he's even hinted at revoking their most favored nation trade status.
Which is a pretty big deal when you think about the global economy. It'll be fascinating to see how these different approaches play out if either of them gets elected.
All right, let's get into some of those tougher topics, starting with crime and justice. We're talking guns, drugs, and potential Supreme Court shakeups, all that good stuff. Harris is calling for stricter gun control things like banning assault weapons and expanding background checks.
Trump's focusing on what he calls the migrant crime epidemic and taking down those drug cartels. He's even suggested the death penalty for drug dealers.
Definitely a controversial stance. And speaking of controversial, let's talk environment. We've got a classic battle between green initiatives and fossil fuels here. Harris wants to build on the Inflation Reduction Act, keep pushing for clean energy solutions.
Trump wants to ditch the Paris Agreement, get rid of environmental regulations, and basically unleash those fossil fuels. Talk about two completely opposite visions for America's environmental future.
No kidding. All right, let's move on to education, another area where these two have very different ideas. Harris wants to make childcare and preschool more affordable and tackle that student loan crisis.
She's also against private school vouchers, which brings us to Trump. He's all about school choice, wants to give families money to spend on private schools or homeschooling.
And get this, He's even proposed closing the entire Department of Education and letting states handle it all.
That's a pretty radical idea, right? It would completely change the education landscape in America.
Now let's touch on abortion, a topic that's always incredibly sensitive. Harris is a staunch defender of abortion rights and wants to guarantee nationwide legality.
Trump, however, sees abortion as a state-level issue. He hasn't explicitly said he'd sign a national abortion ban, but his stance definitely leans more towards the pro-life movement.
Okay, on to healthcare. Harris wants to keep building on the Affordable Care Act, expand coverage and lower costs. She sees healthcare as a right, not a privilege.
Trump's been critical of the Affordable Care Act and wants to find alternatives. But here's a twist. He supports easier access to IVF, which might surprise some people.
And finally, we come to election laws, a topic that's gotten pretty heated lately. Harris wants to pass laws to protect voting rights and make it easier for people to vote.
Trump, on the other hand, keeps pushing that narrative that the 2020 election was stolen. He's calling for stricter voter ID laws and a shift towards paper ballots.
So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the key policy differences between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's a lot to process, right?
It is. We've covered a ton of ground here, but don't worry, we're not done yet. In our next segment, we're going to dive deeper into some of these policies and explore how they could actually impact your life. Welcome back to our deep dive into the 2024 election. We just laid out the battle lines between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and now it's time to dig a little deeper.
Right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of these policies and see how they could actually affect you, your wallet, your day-to-day life. We started with the economy, so let's pick up there.
If we zoom out and look at the big picture, both candidates are trying to answer the same question. How do we make America more prosperous? But they're coming at it from totally different angles.
Harris seems to be all about investing in people, right? Tax cuts for the middle class, affordable childcare, making college more accessible. The idea is to empower individuals and let that have a ripple effect.
Exactly. It's a bottom-up approach. Build a stronger middle class and everything else will benefit. Trump's strategy is more top-down. He's betting that cutting taxes for corporations and easing regulations will make businesses thrive, create more jobs, and ultimately lift everyone up.
So classic trickle-down economics. But hasn't that been tried before with, shall we say, mixed results?
Yeah, that's a debate economists have been having for decades. There's no easy answer. What's important is to understand the assumptions behind each approach. Harris seems to believe the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field and protecting workers.
Well, Trump seems to think the free market knows best, and that the government often messes things up more than it helps.
You got it. And these different philosophies show up in almost every policy area. Take immigration, for example. Harris sees it as a strength, a way to enrich our culture and our economy. She wants to create a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and make the whole system fairer.
Trump's coming at it from a security and national identity angle. Walls, deportations, making legal immigration harder. That's his focus.
What's fascinating is how Trump's proposal to automatically give green cards to foreign graduates of U.S. universities seems to contradict that hardline stance.
It's like he's admitting that America needs skilled workers, even if they weren't born here. It could be a savvy move to appeal to a certain segment of voters.
Those little nuances can tell you a lot about a candidate's true priorities.
Okay, what about housing? Harris has that ambitious plan to build 3 million affordable homes. Sounds great, but how would she actually pull that off?
Well, she's talking about a combination of government spending, tax incentives, and regulatory changes. She also wants to penalize companies that are hoarding homes and driving up prices. So it's a multi-pronged approach to boost supply and crack down on speculation.
Trump's solution seems a lot simpler. Reduce immigration and housing costs will go down.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence to back that up?
The link between immigration and housing costs is complicated. Economists don't all agree. Some studies show immigration can increase demand for housing, pushing up prices in certain areas. Others argue that immigrants often take jobs Americans don't want, which contributes to economic growth that benefits everyone in the long run.
So not as straightforward as Trump makes it sound.
Definitely not. These issues need nuanced solutions, not just catchy slogans.
All right, let's get into workers' rights. This is where we see a real clash of ideologies. Harris is pro-union, believes they give workers a voice and protect their interests. Trump seems to view unions as obstacles to business growth.
And that difference in perspective shows up in their stances on the PRO Act. Harris would sign it, Trump's against it. And remember, Trump has even said he'd consider firing striking workers.
That's a pretty extreme stance. It sounds like he's serious about curbing the power of unions.
No doubt about it. It raises questions about where he really stands on workers' rights.
Let's shift gears again and talk about foreign policy. Both candidates talk about peace through strength, but their approaches are worlds apart.
Harris seems to prefer working with allies to tackle global challenges like climate change and nuclear proliferation. She's also emphasizing diplomacy and engagement, even with countries like Iran and China.
Trump's more skeptical of international institutions and alliances. He's more willing to go it alone, using military force or economic pressure to get what he wants. Remember America first. That sums up his approach very well.
His stance on China is especially interesting. He talks about strategic independence, which basically means reducing our reliance on them for things like trade and manufacturing. And he's even suggested revoking their most favored nation trade status, which would have huge economic consequences.
But he's also praised President Xi Jinping in the past. It's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it?
It is. Trump seems to admire China's economic power while also viewing them as a threat to American dominance. His policies reflect that tension.
Okay, let's move on to crime and justice. Another area with stark contrasts. Harris wants to address the root causes of crime: poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. She also wants to reform the criminal justice system, reduce mass incarceration, and focus on rehabilitation.
Trump's all about law and order, emphasizing punishment and deterrence. That call for the death penalty for drug dealers is a perfect example.
It's a very different philosophy. One's about rehabilitation, the other's about retribution.
And there's a lot of evidence that mass incarceration hasn't made us safer. It's actually made communities less safe.
Okay, let's talk environment. This one's pretty straightforward. Harris is all about tackling climate change, investing in renewable energy, and protecting our natural resources. Trump denies the science of climate change and wants to deregulate the fossil fuel industry.
It's the classic clash between environmental protection and economic growth. Harris thinks we can have both, while Trump seems to prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability.
And that's a choice that will have huge consequences for generations to come.
Absolutely. It's a decision voters will have to weigh very carefully.
Now let's look at education. Harris is a big believer in public education and wants to make it more affordable and accessible. She's against those private school vouchers, arguing that they take money away from public schools.
Trump's a big fan of school choice. He wants to give parents more options, including private schools, charter schools, and homeschooling. And that proposal to shut down the Department of Education is a pretty radical move.
It would completely change how education works in America.
And it shows how deeply he distrusts the federal government and how much he believes that education should be handled locally.
Let's move on to the very sensitive topic of abortion. Harris is firmly pro-choice and wants to codify Roe v. Wade into law, guaranteeing nationwide access to safe and legal abortion.
Trump, on the other hand, has appointed conservative judges to the Supreme Court who overturned Roe v. Wade. He thinks abortion is a state issue, not a federal one.
It's a hugely divisive issue that has polarized the country for decades. And with the Supreme Court now solidly conservative, the stakes are higher than ever.
It's going to be a major issue in the 2024 election, for sure.
Okay, on to healthcare. Harris wants to build on the Affordable Care Act, expand coverage, and bring down costs. She believes healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Trump has tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act multiple times. He prefers a market-based approach, arguing that competition will lower costs and lead to better quality care.
But the Affordable Care Act has helped millions of Americans get health insurance. Wouldn't repealing it leave a lot of people without coverage?
It would, but it's also been criticized for being expensive and overly complicated. Trump thinks there's a better way and that a more market-driven approach will benefit everyone in the long run.
It's a debate that's been going on for years, and there are strong arguments on both sides. But healthcare is a top concern for voters, and both candidates need to address it.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of election laws, which has gotten pretty heated lately. Harris wants to strengthen voting rights and make it easier to vote. She supports things like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, and expanded early voting.
Trump keeps saying the 2020 election was stolen, even though there's no evidence to support that. He's calling for stricter voter ID laws and limits on mail-in voting.
Those kinds of tactics have been used to suppress voter turnout, especially among minority groups. It's a worrying trend that threatens the very core of our democracy.
So there you have it. We've gone deeper into the key policy differences between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. As you can see, their visions for America are vastly different.
These aren't just abstract policy debates. They will have real consequences for all of us.
Exactly. These policies will affect your job, your healthcare, your education, your environment. They will shape the future of our country. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've spent the last two segments unpacking the policy platforms of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, really dissecting their visions for America.
We've covered a lot of ground from the economy and immigration to healthcare and education. It's a lot to take in, but hopefully you're starting to see how these policies could actually affect your life.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about these policy differences?
These aren't just abstract political debates happening in some ivory tower. These policies have real-world consequences for you, your family, your community. They will shape the future of this country.
Exactly. Think about it. Who do you trust to manage the economy? Who has the best plan to create jobs and make sure people are paid a fair wage? Who's going to protect your healthcare, your environment, your rights?
These are the questions you need to ask yourself as you're weighing your options. Because in a democracy, your vote is your voice. It's your chance to shape the future you want to see.
And beyond those specific policies, there's something else to consider. The values and philosophies driving these candidates.
What's fascinating is that Harris and Trump represent two very different visions of America. Harris believes in a more inclusive, equitable society where everyone has a chance to succeed regardless of their background.
Trump seems to be tapping into a sense of nostalgia, a longing for a time when America was supposedly great. He emphasizes strength dominance and a more go-it-alone approach on the world stage.
Those contrasting visions are reflected in their policies, their rhetoric, their whole approach to governing. So when you're listening to these candidates, pay attention not just to what they're saying, but to the values and beliefs behind their words.
Because ultimately, that's what will shape the future of America. We've given you a lot to think about today, and we encourage you to dig into the source material yourself. Don't just take our word for it.
Read their platforms, watch their speeches, listen to their interviews, talk to people who have different views. The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to make a decision that aligns with your values and your vision for the future.
So we'll leave you with this final thought-provoking question. Beyond the policies, beyond the rhetoric, what kind of America do you want to see? And which candidate do you think can lead us there?